This is a presentation on the American Industrial Revolution, which happens largely after the end of the Civil War in 1865. It's a time of massive changes in the country, and it really marks the beginning of what we think of as modern America. Now, what was it? Well, first of all, a huge amount of mass production, producing amounts of all kinds of products, steel, for example, beyond anything that was produced before. And along with that, distribution to national markets. If you produce products in huge quantities, that's not going to do you any good unless you can get those products to market. And unless you can get the raw materials to your factory to produce the products in the first place. So along with the production comes the distribution. And of course, the railroad plays a critical role in this. There are increasing ties or bonds, economic integration of the North and the West especially, more so than the South. For example, cattle ranching was growing enormously in the West. But that wasn't going to do any good to people in the East unless they could find an inexpensive, efficient way to bring that cattle to market. So cattle, for example, were driven by cowboys to the railheads until the railroad spread, and then the cowboys became far less necessary. And they were shipped on cattle cars to stockyards or slaughterhouses. And then after being processed into meat, what's known as meat packing, they were transported on refrigerated rail cars to markets in the East. So it was possible now for people in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, for example, to get fresh beef, where that was far less possible earlier and far more expensive earlier. To give you an idea of how much difference this made, one head of cattle was worth about $4 in Texas, but about $40 in the East. So there was a tremendous motivation to pursue this. On the other hand, the North was sending huge amounts of products to the West. So there was a lot of this, what we call economic integration or connections between the economies of the North and the West. There were also tremendous economies of scale involved in this, and this is a term that you need to know. Economies means savings, and scale means size here. So you can produce each item more cheaply if you produce a lot of them. And that means more products are available at lower prices to more people. Now, along with this is growing productivity. Productivity has a definition. It is the ratio of output to hours worked. So in other words, how much can you produce in a given amount of time? How much can one worker produce, let's say, in 1 hour? Well, it turns out that workers could produce a lot more with the kinds of technology that were being developed in the Industrial Revolution. Machines, driven often by electricity, etc. Now, this led to lower prices but higher sales. More people had more things if they could afford to buy them. A lot of workers were very poorly paid, and the wealth that was produced during this time was very unevenly distributed. Along with this, there's something that we've looked at earlier in the course, and that is de-skilling. If you break down an assembly process or some kind of manufacturing process to a lot of little parts, then you can hire unskilled or low-skilled workers to do each one of these parts of the process and pay them less and be less worried that they're going to go out on strike, because if they do, you can fire them and hire somebody else. This created a great deal of boredom for workers, It created repetitive stress injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome, and it made them very insecure in their jobs. Uh, Large national corporations start to emerge during this time. Before the Civil War, there was really nothing on the scale of Carnegie Steel or Standard Oil, for example. And as I've said, there was much greater wealth overall, but vastly unequal distribution of that wealth. Now, for an industrial revolution to happen, there are a number of things that are necessary, and the United States had all of them. One was an agricultural surplus produced by fewer farmers. Uh, Earlier in history, it may have taken 80 or 90%, let's say in the early Middle Ages in Europe, to feed the society, to produce the food that society needed to survive. Well, if you can do that with fewer people, then you free up those people to do other things. And that was going on in the United States. For example, the number of farmers' hours necessary to produce a bushel of wheat over a period of several decades went from 61 hours down to a little over 3 hours. That's the kind of improved efficiency or productivity that was achieved in agriculture. The U.S. had all kinds of natural resources, which are, of course, necessary for mass production, and also a sufficient workforce. And immigration provided this. For most of American history, immigrants were valued. They weren't always treated well. There was a lot of nativism or dislike of immigrants, but not too many people suggested, at least those with political power suggested, that they be barred from entering the country. There were groups that wanted to do just that, but immigrants mostly had the ability to come to the United States if they chose to. And the reason for this is that their labor was extremely valuable. Now, along with this immigrant labor, however, this workforce was elastic. That means it could grow or shrink. So if times were bad, if there was a lot of unemployment, as there was, for example, during the economic depressions beginning in 1873 and 1893, then some of these immigrants would go back to their own countries. Some of those who had moved to the cities from rural America turned around and went back to family farms, and that meant that the workforce could shrink when there wasn't work to be done. And that was something that industrial America also welcomed because it created fewer problems in cities. To have an industrial revolution, you need a stable government. There were no revolutions here. Elections resulted in winners and losers, and the results of those elections were put into practice. And there were policies that strongly favored business. It was very difficult, if not impossible, to form labor unions in many cases. The companies were not required to observe a lot of regulations. The courts very much sided with business. And this wasn't a good thing for most workers, but it did create the Industrial Revolution in some ways and increased production. It increased the total amount of wealth, but not the distribution of that wealth in ways that favored the majority of workers. You need a good transportation system, and railroads provided that in a big way. You need markets, places to sell your goods, and they came from a rapidly growing population in the United States. You needed education and technology, and those were growing rapidly also, even though many, many workers did not need a great deal of education to do unskilled jobs. There were still many jobs that did require education, and it was growing during this period as well. And you need capital. That is, capital you could define as money invested for the purpose of making more money. And with the natural resources, with the businesses that were already thriving, there was money available for investment. So the United States had all of the pieces necessary to create this rapid industrial revolution. Now, economists sometimes talk about leading sectors of an economy. A leading sector is one part of the economy. A sector is one part of the economy. For example, healthcare or transportation or manufacturing. And one of these parts of the economy usually leads the way in getting the ball rolling toward an industrial revolution. In Britain, it was textiles. In Germany, it was chemicals and steel. And those were the other two countries that had the largest industrial revolutions during this period. And in the United States, it was railroads. Because of the huge distances involved, the size of the country, the distances that raw materials had to be carried to get to factories, the large distances that finished products had to travel in order to get to markets, to people who wanted to buy them. And so railroads became kind of the economic engine that drove the Industrial Revolution. And it did this in lots of ways. Railroads, for example, helped steel production. They helped lumbering because of all the railroad ties, the supports for the tracks that had to be produced. They they helped mail order businesses that could not have really developed without the railroad. And there are all sorts of ways in which railroads drove the whole process. Now, we can get a sense of how much the railroads grew by looking at a series of maps. This is the map of the rail network of the United States on the eve of the Civil War in 1860. You'll see that most of the railroad construction is in the north. In the south, it's scattered, and often there are lines that don't connect to very much. Here's one in Alabama, for example, that starts nowhere and ends nowhere, in a sense. You see similar things here in Florida and elsewhere. Here's one in around Sacramento, California, that doesn't really go anywhere except locally. Now look at what happens by 1870. The big news here is the Transcontinental Railroad. And now, as of 1869, the nation is connected from coast to coast by rail. Then 10 years later, in 1880, you see a good deal of rail construction in the West and massive rail construction, especially in the Great Lakes area. The rapidly industrializing cities like Chicago, like Cleveland, like Detroit, and you get a sense of the level of economic growth. And then by 1890, you have an incredible amount of railroad construction. Just to give you a sense of some of the growth that happened during the Industrial Revolution, look what happens to population. It goes up by about 2.5 times in 40 years. That's very rapid growth. Steel production goes from almost nothing to 11,000 tons of steel by 1900, and this would continue to expand very rapidly into the 20th century. Telephones hadn't been invented in 1860, and they were in 1876, and then from 1880 to 1900, you go from 48,000 to 1.3 million. The miles of railroad track went from 30,000 to more than 200,000. So this gives you an idea of the size of this economic phenomenon.